Hello, and thank you for joining us for tonight's real conversation, Performative versus Normative, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, moving away from deficit thinking. I'm Jessica Colorado, and I'm so excited to host and moderate tonight's discussion. During my time at the university, I completed a bachelor's in chemistry before working as a staff member at the David T. Kern Center, which led me to complete my master's in science degree in educational policy at the Warner School of Education. As a double alumna, I've been honored to continue to engage with the university's Diversity Advisory Council, as well as a volunteer in the newly formed First Generation Alumni Network. As a policy analyst with the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association in Washington, D.C., my work focuses on analyzing state data systems to improve student outcomes, something that aligns really well with our speaker's research, so I'm very excited for tonight's reel. REAL, or Rochester's Equity Access Leadership Conversations, is a virtual series focusing on authentic discussions around equity, measurable action, and meaningful change. Now, more than ever, when the topics of diversity, inclusion, and equity and access are central to today's pressing issues in our country, we as a university are committed to engaging in candid and courageous conversations, listening to each other, and engaging in effective action to address these issues. This event is brought to you by the University of Rochester's Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement in partnership with the Office of Equity and Inclusion and the Diversity Advisory Council. Before we get started, I want to mention we'll share some housekeeping and helpful Zoom tips in the chat box. If you would like to ask a question, you may submit it at any time through the Q&A function that is located at the bottom of the screen. I'm excited to welcome you all to share in this virtual space together and to introduce our esteemed speaker. But first, I want to say thank you to our captioner and interpreters who are helping ensure this program is accessible. Efforts are being made around the country to encourage educational reform in the areas of equity, access, diversity, and inclusion. May be viewed as only for show. How can we shift away from performative demonstrations of support and move into action? Utilizing her multidisciplinary research and a variety of asset-based conceptual frameworks like funds of knowledge, community cultural wealth, and the forms of capital, Dr. Cecilia Rios Aguilar will help us explore how cultural experiences can be used to develop strategies to overcome disparities and enact long-term normative change. Born in Mexico City, Dr. Cecilia Rios Aguilar achieved her dream of getting a master's degree in the United States, earning a master's in science and educational administration, as well as a PhD in educational theory and policy from the Warner School of Education at the University of Rochester, and attained her bachelor's in economics from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. She became an assistant professor at the University of Arizona and an associate professor at Claremont Graduate University in California. Dr. Rios Aguilar then moved to UCLA, first directing the Higher Education Research Institute before becoming a professor of education and associate dean of equity, diversity, and inclusion at UCLA's School of Education and Information Studies. She also currently serves as a faculty co-director of policy analysis of California Education and as a board member of the Spencer Foundation. With support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others, Dr. Rios Aguilar's research is multidisciplinary and uses a variety of asset-based conceptual frameworks and of statistical approaches to study the educational and occupational trajectories of marginalized students, and remains focused on the issues that marginalized students face in education. Currently, Dr. Rios Aguilar is examining how community college students make decisions about majors, jobs, and careers. Welcome, Cecilia.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here with you. Thanks, Jessica, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the University of Rochester for giving me this opportunity to be back virtually, but it is really an honor for me to be here with you. I have very fond memories of my life in Rochester, and I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen just to give me some sense of helping me, giving me cues about what I want to share with you today. So I'm going to do that, making sure that you get to see my screen. So what I want to do today is to share with you my journey, not only into academia, but into EDI work. I know some people talk about DEI or EDI. I prefer the equity, diversity, and inclusion, or at least I'm used to that. And I labeled it part 1 and part 2, and you'll see why I do that intentionally, because it has shifted. And I wanna share that story. And I also want to share some of the strategies we're putting in place, short and long run processes and strategies, I call, around 3 things that I think are related to EDI and that you may take away from today's conversation, real conversation. I really, really appreciate the title and the opportunity to have these more authentic, careful conversations with each other. I want to share with you some of the values and principles that are guiding our work, an exercise that we started that we label as the EDI organizational benchmarking exercise or rubric, and these more community-based approaches to conflict management and resolution, particularly the role of Edi Ambassadors that we just started at the School of Education at UCLA. I'm gonna, let me see, my screen just got stuck, so sorry for that. I cannot even stop sharing. I apologize for that. My computer went nuts. I label some of these initial part 1 of my journey as from Mexico City suburb to UCLA, my not so glamorous journey into academia. And the reason I title it like that is because I feel in many ways that I shouldn't be where I am. I still doubt sometimes myself as to, is it really happening? Is this girl that had this dream of having a master's in the United States really made it to this point? I don't know if many of you saw that movie Roma that was released not too long ago by Netflix, apparently a big hit, but it really showed where I was born, the first house I lived in with my family. It's called La Colonia Roma, Tepeji. That's the first house. And I was a lucky girl. I was born into a wonderful family that valued education and did everything. My parents did everything they could to put us into private school, which is a luxury in Mexico. This is me right here. I don't know if you see my cursor, but that's me. I attended a private school that actually was a Japanese immersion program. So I learned to speak Japanese and Spanish at the same time. Again, a lot of privilege and a lot of luxury, which I didn't understand at the time. I just went to school, right? And then, of course, I had a successful journey that put me into college. My mom did not finish, did finish middle school, but wasn't able to go to high school. She was just working, and that's what was allowed at her time. My dad did end up going to college, and he is a college graduate, but we never talked about college in my house. We never talked about what that meant, what that looked like, what it meant to be a college student. We just were expected to go to college as a lot of middle class people with privilege, like me in my case. I ended up attending the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, as Jessica pointed out. And I attended this, again, small private college that specialized a lot in economics. And that's the field I entered. I had absolutely no idea what I had signed up for. But it sounded like something I could do that had numbers. And I was curious enough to say, and I was stubborn enough to say, if I enter, I finish. Right? I've been a stubborn person in that sense, and has helped me in many ways, in others not so much. But I started to become very concerned about what I was studying. And while I was driving back home, I saw a different Mexico. I didn't see the world that I was raised in, right, with private schools and access to these opportunities, going to college. And I started questioning why was the case, why other people didn't have the same, well, there was so much poverty around me. So I started, and then the more classes I took, the more I couldn't see myself and my interests, my concerns, or the people that I was spending time with outside of college were reflected in anything that I was doing in economics. Not even my gender was reflected in that. I had many, many classmates that were male, mostly male professors. It was kind of hard to find myself in that field. So I started to get disengaged from academically speaking, not skipping a lot of classes, doing the bare minimum to pass them. And I started spending a lot of time thinking about education, taking trips to rural areas to try to understand what was happening. In some cases, I thought, oh, I'm going to do this social service, right? I'm going to teach adults who don't know how to read and write, how to do that. And I got so much more out of that. I thought I was going to teach them something, but I learned much more than what I technically taught them. I learned about the resources that they have, the way they exchange and are reciprocal among each other. And they gave us everything. Every time I visited any of these places, we sat at the food table and they would give us everything before they ate themselves. That stuck with me. So when I came back to Mexico City, I had a group of friends in college, and I heard they were trying to create a nonprofit. And it became this, Educa, Fundación Educa México. It's a nonprofit that we created as college students, where we would serve as a resource hub for other nonprofits that were providing education to marginalized or low-income kids in Mexico. That experience changed my perspective. And I found my passion in education. But I had to continue, right? I was stubborn enough that I had to continue my journey in economics. I will tell you that because I was so disengaged with the field, I failed some courses. I failed my statistics courses in particular, and I believe it was macroeconomics, one of the macro series I failed. So in order for me to graduate on time, I had to catch up. And one of my friends told me, if you go to the school, to Berkeley, and register for these courses, you don't catch up in the summer, so you can graduate on time with us. It's a brilliant idea. So I asked my father for support economically and of course emotional, and I enrolled in Berkeley for the summer session to catch up. I was able to do that, and that experience again changed me. I saw the place, the institution, the access to these resources intellectually. And, and I said, this is where I want to come. I want to come back to this. But I had to finish college and go back and face my own reality, which is I needed to work after getting my degree in economics. I found a job in the private sector, but remain deeply connected to Educa and to education outside of my work. I became actually a part-time instructor, a lecturer in a local university. I had that first experience teaching, and again, I felt so alive. I could see how I could probably change some of the students' perspectives about the field, about what they were about to do in the field of economics. So I felt very empowered, and it conflicted again with this private world where it was profit-seeking activities. So I decided to apply to a master's degree. I wasn't sure if it was going to be in economics or in education. And I'm going to go turn back to this slide. The person in the picture here is a Nobel Prize in Economics for his human capital contribution, Dr. Gary Becker, who rests in peace. He had come to Mexico City for a trip to give a presentation in one of the nonprofit areas that I was working on. And he and I connected and had a very, very special couple of days. We talked and talked and talked, and he told me, contact me when you're ready to apply for grad school. So I did. I worked at Cinemex. I was a manager. I was able to get to that level, and I said, I'm ready to go. So I contacted Dr. Becker, and he told me, he asked me one question. He said, how long do you have to understand the field of economics? Because this is going to take you 30 years to really understand what economics is about. And I can't. I had this sense of urgency to do something, to help people. I said, no, I can't wait. He said, then do something else. Don't do a PhD in economics. Don't enter that field. So he suggested to me, go to the University of Rochester, apply to Stanford, apply to these very specific places where they had this field of economics of education, and that I could do both. Thanks to him, I applied to the University of Rochester. I applied to 4 other places, but a lot of people ask me, why did you end up going there? And the answer that I give to people is because I felt heard, because I felt I could be myself there. I didn't see myself necessarily reflected as a Latina or Mexican immigrant there, but I felt heard. I felt there was something that I could do there, that I could be myself and do the type of work that I wanted to do, which in my head at that time was very economics oriented. But my life changed there. I started to have a lot of course classes in history and in law, in business, in statistics, and I did a lot of internships, including an internship in the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans that changed again my perspective. And then I found professors who again understood me and understood the type of research that I wanted to do. And one professor in particular, Professor Larson, gave me this paper in my qualitative research methods class. I was trying to look for a concept that would really capture the richness of Latino families. And she handed me this paper on fonts of knowledge, qualitative approaches to understanding Latino households. I read it and I said, this is it. Not only she gave me that paper, but years later, she said, I can introduce you to the scholars who are doing this work on fonts of knowledge. And she did. And Louis Moll, who is the professor who coined this term, opened me the doors to also more opportunities and asked me to apply to a job at the University of Arizona, which is where I landed next. I went there to start my academic trajectory as an assistant professor in the College of Education. I switched my focus from K through 12 and policy to really doing this link between K through 12 and higher education, particularly on community colleges. And I continue using this framework, this term, fonts of knowledge, which basically is the assets and the resources that families and students bring to our institutions. How can we use them? How can we build processes, pedagogy, curriculum as a result of this richness that they have in their daily lives? I had the privilege and the luxury of learning from them, with them, and I visited more and more families, talked to them to really, really understand and deepen my knowledge about these frameworks. I ended up moving to California 4 or 5 years later, and I took a job at the School of Educational Studies at Claremont Graduate University. The reason why I left Arizona, a lot of people have asked me that. I felt great. I had a great community, but I was an expert witness on a legal case for English language learners. And at that time, I didn't feel supported as an assistant professor who didn't have tenure there. So I faced significant challenges as part of that process of doing research and volunteering to be an expert witness that we're going to testify against the state, being a state employee, representing what the case was about, English language learners. Moved to California, and then I found my home here at Claremont, and it was an excellent experience. I learned a lot from very different groups of students, working professionals. I started to think differently and to learn with undocumented students, which I had thought about, but I had really never spent time understanding them. Similarly, with students who were formerly incarcerated, I had, of course, read something about that, but I was very naive and I was very ignorant. So Claremont gave me an opportunity to think much more carefully and deeply about different groups of students that I had not yet considered in my research. I moved to California, and this is my family. These are my people. I became a mother scholar, and this also has shifted a lot the way I see my work and the way I approach my work. And finally, I land at UCLA after some years of being at Claremont. As Jessica mentioned, I directed the Higher Education Research Institute 2015, and in 2018, I became an EDI Dean, Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I wrote this piece called The Parallels of Parenting and Moving Towards Equity. The day my former dean, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, asked me to join as Associate Dean, he said this to me. He said, Cecilia, I would like you to be the next Associate Dean. I would like you to think about it. And the reason why I'm asking you to become the next Associate Dean of EDI is because students respect you. And I still have that phrase in my head about respecting. The students felt that I could listen to them, that I could see them. And that was so important to me and so valuable to me that I said, sure. I said, sure, but I was naive. I really did not understand what it takes to do EDI work. I mentioned this blog because it documents some of my own journey of becoming an EDI, Equity Advisors. We're known as that across campus here at UCLA. And these are the key lessons that I learned from, I would say, 2018, that I became an associate dean to before the pandemic erupted. And these are the lessons I want to share with you today. First is, do not assume that faculty like me, who examine inequities and are interested in that work and that use asset-based frameworks, know how to do EDI work. Clearly, the intention and the respect and was there for me. It was not of why I'm here, but it's how I got here and what is my toolkit? Do I have the skill set to be able to? I never asked myself that. And I think we tend to assume that faculty like me are prepared and ready to enter into these roles. I wrote in the blog, I only know that I'm doing my best. Estoy haciendo la lucha. Some of my students in that Fonts of Knowledge book talk about the same thing. There is this very strong value and respect to hard work. So I knew how to do hard work and I was willing to do hard work, but I didn't know how. I didn't know even where to start doing EDI work. You have to listen actively, constantly listening. And I think that what two of the things that I think I learned the most is addressing the illusion that we're doing great. I'm going to try to be a little bit more clear on this point. If you go to the UCLA website currently and look at the diversity of faculty and students of our school, it's actually pretty good. So yes, representation matters, but then that becomes also a barrier sometimes because racial incidents keep happening in my building. And that's what I mean by we need to address this illusion that, we look great on numbers. We have this image in ourselves, in our head, that somehow the school is very diverse. So that's it. We did our part. And that was not, that was something I wanted to address as an associate dean. I also been learning that it takes a village. Just we say the same thing. It takes a village to raise kids. Well, similarly, this work cannot be done by one person. It should not. EDI work is everybody's work. And the other thing I also learned is that don't just hope for things to happen. EDI work requires strategic planning. And I will even share the second part of my journey. But it just, we sometimes hope like, oh, I hope I see a more diverse student body. Maybe luckily next year we'll engage in some conversations and that's it. We do a lot of EDI work is like wishful thinking, but not strategic thinking. And that's something I started to learn as I engage in this work. And in order to switch from just thinking asset-based to doing asset-based to practices, we need a whole different set of skill set and activities within ourselves, including reflection. And I have this term that I like a lot. It's called conviviality, the practice of conviviality. That yes, it comes from our funds of knowledge, asset-based frameworks, but to me, it puts in practice. It makes the goal clear. Conviviality is the ability to see others in me, right? To see others. We have so much in common as human beings. And I know, so when somebody asks, what are asset-based frameworks or asset-based thinking? Is trying to see students not as, oh, they don't have these things. They don't succeed because they're not prepared. They don't have opportunity. They don't access them. Lately, I've been hearing a lot about students are too busy. Well, too busy because they have to live and they have to survive and they have to find the economic means to do that. They have to feed their families. The pandemic has brought a whole different reality in front of us. So we have to change, to switch the deficit thinking of students don't having that to, and we always put the onus on the students, but not on the institutions. But we always say students are the ones that are not doing this and they don't have that and they don't read and they don't do that. But in reality, a lot is our structures, our practices, the way we structure things, programs, processes that is actually counter to students. As I mentioned earlier from my own journey, I couldn't see myself in my discipline, in my college. I became very disengaged. My GPA is actually pretty low from college. I couldn't access scholarships in Mexico to be able to come to study to the US because of my low GPA. And I like to make that very clear because what I'm asking ourselves is to be able to shift that, to see that for a lot of low-income students of color, similar things happen. They don't see themselves in the institutions, in our institutions, in the curriculum. They feel they don't belong there. And then we make it very complicated for them to succeed. So what I want us is to think about this practicing of conviviality, of how can we work together and see ourselves in others and others in me, that we all have our doubts, our moments of difficulty, but that we also bring so much to the table that institutions are right now not using. And I'm going to give more of a concrete example in a few minutes. Let's see where I am here. I call the second part of my journey into EDI work. So I had written about these. We were changing deans at the moment, and the pandemic hits. We were starting to address some of these things, thinking, yes, we have to be more strategic. I had been reflecting and publishing about it, being very clear. And I labeled this second part of my journey as the wake-up call. And the wake-up call being, of course, the pandemic and the racial reckoning. Pandemics. Some of us think about this as dual pandemics, not just the health one, but the racial reckoning and the racial unrest that we all experienced. And that was nothing new, but it was a reminder that is something we had not and have not been able to address and to change, make systemic changes. And of course, we're seeing the display of impact, disproportionate impact of the pandemic on communities of color, and then the racial unrest. And we're changing leadership, our dean. We're trying to address the pandemic and its disproportionate impact, trying to, write a statement, right? When George Floyd was killed, and everybody's trying to write a statement. I remember that day very clearly. Trying to, okay, who writes what? What's the message? Who gets what? Communications goes back and forth, and who decides what gets written? I didn't feel comfortable with what was written for mine, but in the midst of the urgency of, there go out these statements of support. Months later, we received a letter addressing or giving us demands and from our Black Bruins. And I have this quote here so that you can read and say that these public statements of solidarity are okay, but the department has failed to execute any tangible institutional change to promote racial equity for Black people of the SEIS community. That's just an excerpt of the letter. There were grievances, 7 grievances, and the demands. I just recently have an article that addresses this letter. Is publicly available. It's in social media. There's nothing to hide or to not be able to talk about. I want to share this because this was a wake-up moment for us. Our Black Brewing colleagues reminded us that historically we have continued to make statements and say words, but we have failed to address, execute any tangible institutional changes. That was very hard to take, but they gave us a chance. They gave us an opportunity to do something different and to address their demands, which, in all honesty, we just had to humbly accept and admit we have failed. We get distracted. We move into other things depending on the urgency or the topic, but we had failed to make systemic changes to promote racial equity for Black people in our community. And I feel we're given a chance to partner differently, to not only, as I said before, right? I said that EDI works requires strategic planning. Well, it does require strategic planning, a budget, and a timeline, which is exactly what our Black Brewing colleagues ask us. These are our demands. Meet them. We want a concrete timeline and resources allocated to these demands. And we're actively working with them on this. The reporter who wrote the note or the article on this process that we've been following with our Black Bruins have asked me, do you feel have you met the demands? And And I told her, don't ask me, ask my community. I think we are partnering and we are making progress, but we can't celebrate yet. And that's what one of our Black Bruins mentioned in that article, in that news, that she said, we're hopeful, but we don't know yet. We can't celebrate yet. Again, because sometimes we get distracted with this work. There's new budget models for the university. There's a new executive vice chancellor, and there's new things coming and programs, and we get distracted. But what our Black Brewing colleagues have asked us and urged us to do is to sharpen our focus, to put timeline and concrete resources. And that's what I've learned in this new part of my role, to be attentive to. I call this renewal. This is a time where we are renewing our commitment to EDI in the school. And we start with this process. I think one of the things that I want you, audience, to take away today is that what I found very valuable was engaging with our community as to what are exactly our values and principles. I found a lot that when we throw the EDI term, it's just loose. We don't define it. And not only we don't define it, but there's not a shared common definition. We may end up, each person or each member of our community, with a different understanding. So we wanted to work first on, can we work together to define and seek feedback so that we can make sure that we get to a shared understanding of what are we striving for. And you can go to our website. I can share the link so that you can see exactly how we define equity, diversity, inclusion. Now we added justice. So now we have the Office of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And we laid out our values, which are not just justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, but also intersectionality, anti-Blackness. We're naming things that are important to our community and defining them. Accountability, actions, right? That was a very important step that we, I think, had to do. Now, the second question, not only what are our values, but where do we stand in relation to those values? That's what we call this EDI organizational benchmarking process. We created a rubric, again, collectively, representation from students, staff, and faculty. And we said, what are the dimensions that matter to us? Sense of belonging, diversity. In the case of students, funding. How are funding opportunities allocated? So we devise this instrument, and then we seek feedback from our community. Where do you think we are in relation to these dimensions? Not only that, but how can what are indicators of, or a set of measurements that we can now put in place so that we can measure progress? And I don't mean by this only metrics like representation and how much diversity there is in our school, but also narratives, which is what our Black Brewing colleagues told us. The narratives are so powerful, right? And then the third part that I want the audience to take away is addressing conflict management in our school. Of course, we have to follow processes and legal requirements by the university in terms of, there's the Discrimination Prevention Office, there's Title IX, there's all those formal processes, correct? Formal processes that, of course, we're policies that we have to abide by and definitely follow. But when people in our community experience conflict, racial microaggressions, what happens? How do we address it? I told you just a few minutes earlier, racial microaggressions and racial incidents still happen in my building. in our community. So how are we going to address that? So we have now this role, the Edi Ambassadors, which is as a group of students, faculty and staff that we've trained during this summer and that are available to our community when things happen. We've trained them in responding, in listening, in conflict management and resolution. And we've tried to create this community, and they have, again, if you go to our website, you'll see their names, you see who they are, you see their backgrounds, their identities, and you can make an appointment with them to express your concern, anything that you witness or that you experience yourself. And we have a mechanism now to address it. So the message is we gotta take care of each other. There cannot be just one person, the role of the associate dean of EDI, to address large issues within our community. We gotta take care of each other. That's why we're talking and advocating for community-based approaches to EDI. And going back to that, it takes a village. And by doing this, I had a conversation today with an EDI ambassador who was contacted by a student to report a racial incident. And this student it's an EDI ambassador, a student in our community, saying how important it is for her, this role, how much she's learning just from being able to talk with me, to understand what happened, to think of solutions. And these are local solutions. We want our people to feel they belong, to feel that they can thrive in our school. If we cannot do that, then of course we can offer academic programs, but what I think the pandemic and the racial unrest that we have experienced have pushed higher education institutions, we're going to be accountable colleagues for these EDI metrics and principles. And what our students of color, faculty of color, staff of colors are demanding us is that we move from lip service and statements to real commitments. We recently finished a report. The Spencer Foundation collaborated with the American Educational Research Association. I was part of that effort. We released a report called Voices from the Field. We wanted to understand how grad students and junior faculty of color in particular have experienced the pandemic, what the impact is going to be. And we started talking to them, listening to them. And they told us, yes, representation matters. Yes, but please stop the lip service. We want real commitments. And as I told the reporter that I mentioned earlier, I hope that if she interviews me or community members in a year from today, that people can say that things are different at the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. We're working towards that. And this is why I'm excited to be here today with you to engage in conversation about how we can continue to do this work, about any questions that you may have for me. I'm open and ready to have a conversation with you. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riera Aguilar. That was a fantastic presentation, and I feel like we all got to know you a little bit better through your presentation. And I think a lot of what you said resonated with me as well. I think I also found it very hard to find myself in STEM, in chemistry, in also so many different life experiences changed my perspective on education and what I thought it was. So it all was a fantastic presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before we moved into formal questions, and please, if you haven't had the opportunity, please continue to submit questions in the Q&A. Could you please expand on what you mean by asset-based frameworks?
Sure, I know it's always a term. It's the challenge of my career. For whoever wrote those questions, please know it's been the challenge of my career to try to explain. But think of all the things that we use every day to live. not just to go to college and be successful at work or in college or in academia, where just to live life. We make use of our language, of, the neighbor, we establish relationships with others because we need others to live, right? I take care of your kids if you fix my car. That's a lot of what we found when we study families, and they use language in many ways, and they have so much activities that they engage in day to day, participating in garage sales and so many activities that are not formal work settings in which they learn so much. That's what I mean by asset-based frame, is trying to rescue those assets, those resources, and trying to name it. We put a name that said asset because we're trying to see people and saying everyone brings something to the table. Everybody, not just some people, but every human being brings something to the table. I hope that explains a bit more what I mean by asset-based frameworks.
Yes, thank you so much for that. So I'd like to get into some of the more formal questions. You mentioned your voices from the field and the impact that the pandemic has had on students. And we're still in the midst of a global pandemic. And at the same time, institutions are still riddled with systemic barriers. So in your opinion, what are some ways that COVID has either helped or hurt EDI efforts?
I think for me, what COVID has brought is this, it put a display right in our faces, this disproportionate impact and how communities of color have experienced the pandemic. And I think it has brought, I don't think it has either stopped or accelerated. I think it just brought a sense of urgency for me that we have to act, and we have to act faster because there's so much need out there. I can also tell you that in the case of community colleges, which is my field of expertise, enrollment losses. So many people did not come back to higher education, particularly people of color, low-income students of color. That worries me tremendously. And again, that's a sense of urgency that I feel across the country, not just in California, the community colleges I work with, but it's asking ourselves what different value proposition are we going to make to communities of color so that they trust again in higher education, they see value in higher education. It worries me a lot that we have not been able to make a different value proposition. And if we don't change our policies, practices, what we're just talking about, how we attract and make explicit a value proposition to communities of color, that we're going to have a severe loss of talent and enormous consequences, not just talent, but so many consequences for our democracy, for health, for economic recovery. It's tremendous. So I feel like a sense of urgency. And I think a lot of institutions are trying to do that renewed commitment to EDI.
Yes, I totally agree. You mentioned your research on community colleges, but again, you also, it's largely also focused on your asset-based conceptual framework. What suggestions do you have on how practitioners, especially those who come from like a research background, can include this asset-based thinking in EDI practices and norms?
So I think the immediate connection that we saw in K through 12 was the pedagogy, right? Working with teachers, helping them have a different language, connect what happens at home with what happens at school. Of course, the pandemic has altered all that in that there's not anymore what happens at home and what happens at school, because everything happened in the same place, if it happened. I think what one term that worries me right now that people are using is academic loss or losses, as if nothing good happened during the pandemic, particularly among low-income communities of color. Like academically, of course, they didn't get content. There may be some gaps in knowledge. I mean, I'm not denying that. But there's also, again, way in which you could see mobilization of how they took care of others, and children were witnessing and being part of a whole set of resources and resiliency that we need to be able to capture in some way. That's in the K-12 side, and I really, really hope our field doesn't get trapped into academic loss terms, because we lost a lot of lives, unfortunately, that's for sure. But in terms of learning, I don't believe that we've lost that much. I mean, there's clearly some content loss and things, but I also feel the need to do that shift. In higher education, I think what I've been working on lately is in this idea of, so people ask me, what are asset-based frameworks? How do we use this? I've been working a lot with community colleges on helping them see that students, because they're working in many, many jobs, they bring so many skills to the table. Yet we don't know anything about that. We don't never collect data. What's your work experience? What are the skills associated with that work experience? We basically just tell students, register, you don't know all these, you want to go there, then you need to, in most cases, need to be remediated because you don't know all this. And then it starts to become very challenging, right? What if instead of telling students, you don't know all this, it's like, oh, let's look at your labor history. Oh my God, you already have so much skills in working collaboratively with others, in multitasking. So I'm trying to help institutions see students in terms of skills associated with their jobs, and then help them connect with pathways to different fields, but asking them again to come to higher education, not because they're deficient in skills or because they're academically underprepared, but it's because you want to learn maybe diverse set of skills. Maybe you want to change your career. Maybe you need to reskill yourself in some way. But again, it's a different value proposition. It's not just you don't have X, Y, and Z. It's, oh, you bring all these skills. Let's use them.
Yes, thank you so much. And so there's another question from the audience. Have you ever experienced impatience around the process of developing these shared values and definitions around EDI? The particular attendee who's asked the question has experienced pushback and is spent that is spent on like developing these definitions. So do you have any advice on how or what to do?
I think the impatience is because of the context in which we're, right? I mentioned before, we have this sense of urgency that we've developed, like institutions are asking, okay, when is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? And what's the result? Because I feel we have not done well in the past. So I think we're urged to do that. But I think rushing to the process may take away that collaborative nature. But putting a timeline, I will say, clarifying the expectation of, in our case, the organizational benchmarking effort, we have a clear timeline that we have shared with folks and giving updates constantly of where we're at, renegotiating with our community the timeline, because guess what, we have new variants. We thought we would be in person back and then maybe not. So I think a lot of the work we're going to have to do is going to be very flexible. And clarifying constantly the expectations of when we can do this, but failing to connect with our community and seek for feedback may be a rushness that not result in the results we would like.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to go back to the article from the Chronicle of Higher Education with the letter from the SEIS Black Rooms with their demands. And you mentioned how it parallels to parenting. You didn't know what you were getting into, and it's similar to you parenting your own children. So what advice could you give to those who may be in the same place that you were at that moment, needing to check their privilege? And what are some questions or maybe the checklist you went through that may suggest practitioners to move away from this performative EDI work?
Thank you for the question. I think for me, yes, I related to parenting because it felt like that. It felt I was thrown into this role, again, assuming that I knew how to do it. First, I need to read about strategic planning around EDI. That's why I provided reference to a book. I think equipping also ourselves with a different set of skill sets around conflict management in particular, because a lot of the work that EDI entails is having very difficult conversations, even communication. Every time I need to meet with somebody, I need to send an email saying something that is not going to be very pleasant to read. This guy need to meet with you because I need to talk to you about an incident. So how can we use language in a different way? How can we make sure that we communicate properly what it is, and maybe it's a phone call. I mean, we need to start thinking about different ways to communicate about these issues. But I didn't have that skill set at the moment. I didn't understand that was part of my role. So I don't know if I have a checklist necessarily, but I will say a different type of training, a transition period where we could also learn historically what's been happening. I mean, I had a conversation with a previous associate dean, but it was just a brief conversation, like almost like pass the torch quickly, and just, I really needed a historical perspective. I needed somebody who could share me the history of the place. I didn't know there was that in 2013, they had made a similar set of demands, and that I knew something had happened, but I needed to do my homework well, and I didn't do it. I feel a different onboarding process for EDI, equity advice, whatever name we have, whatever role it is, but definitely I needed to, like you said, check myself, my privileges, almost like write a positionality statement, where I am in relation to these groups, of what I have had contact with, not. As I write in that statement, I was having issues, people in my community were having issues with the building is so old, the elevator doesn't work. So, I started receiving these messages, and I said, who in the university do I need to talk to? Facilities, and this is an EDI issue of accessibility, should not happen. But then where in the landscape of the university, I need to have a much better understanding of facilities, and the work is larger, and it's not, again, we're doing research that examines inequities and using asset-based framework, but the reality is somebody cannot access the elevator. There's no lactation rooms. There's no gender neutral bathroom. There's a whole facilities issue that I had faced, and I didn't know who to call. Like, should I call my dean? Should I call who in the list of people in this institution should I call? So it's very different onboarding process and skill set that we, again, do not prepare faculty to do.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that access was, something that you had to navigate, when you arrived at your institution. And so also in your lessons learned slide, you mentioned strategic planning. It has to be part of the EDI process. And when you say strategic planning, in your experience, who has to be at the table, or who needs a seat at the table to move this EDI work from transformative to normative?
I think I've been now I created partnerships with human resources, with budget office, with department chairs, with everybody needs to. That's why I said it takes a village, and it takes everybody to do this work. Students, staff, faculty, they're all part of the community. So, but let me give you a more concrete example around the issue of strategic planning. Keep hearing we need to diversify our student body. The goal along different dimensions, not just race, ethnicity, and gender. We have identified our needs with data in terms of where we're severely behind Native American students. I can tell you that's a significant issue in our community. But then we talk about this in what month is this? December. We're about to enter admission process. Can we really change something now? Like, is the conversation need to happen in the summer? We need to have equip ourselves with a process to be able to really change our admission process. Not today, but that's what I mean by strategic planning. And then looking at processes and cycles, we have very specific cycles of where we admit, when we have applications, who does that, do we want student voice, do we not want? So there's so many things that we could plan for. Instead of, at this point, it feels like it's wishful thinking. And in the case of Native American Indigenous scholars, what are we hoping? Like, we're going to communicate with them through a website? I mean, it's, again, wishful thinking. That's not how we're going to attract Native scholars. Right. So I think that's what I mean by strategic planning and partnership and a timeline and a budget. So it doesn't become wishful thinking.
Right. Yeah, there's so much that has to go into that, right? The letter from the Black Bruins, one of the demands was for more faculty of color, right? Mm-hmm. And I have not seen a student demand list that does not include that as a demand, right? So in what ways is diversification of faculty a component of normative EDI?
I think it's crucial. All the evidence, we've have research after research after research saying representation matters, right? Part of what I share in my stories, I never saw myself represented in many ways, right? And that's essential, but that's just the beginning. For me, it's equally important, and because of the Voices from the Field report that we just recently released too, I have this quote in my head that I think I will live with for the rest of my career, of a woman of color, junior faculty, that said to us, this is like don't bring me to the pipeline of pain. Right? We can bring faculty of color, and that's what's going to matter for students. Representation, like I said, does matter, but we also have to support and help faculty thrive. Otherwise, like she said, you bring me to the pipeline of pain, you almost also going to dump on me all the EDI work, which is a lot what happened when the racial reckoning erupted. That a lot of weight was put in the faculty of color. So we got to change that. And I can see it playing in different ways right now in tenure cases. Yeah, we extended 1 year. Well, the pandemic is going to affect for years and years and years. 1 year extension in the tenure clock is going to do very little. So we got to take this much more seriously and much more carefully. That is not just bringing people in, but help ensuring that they thrive in our spaces. Otherwise, it can harm and have unintended consequences. And again, this pipeline of pain metaphor that she used, or real, not even metaphor, it's so real and so crystal clear for me that it was very telling, and I keep it in my head a lot.
Yeah, it's so important. And I know you do a lot of that work within the graduate school, so that's very important. I was wondering if the EDI bench work process that you've established, is that unique to the graduate school? Is that, or also UCLA wide?
We start in our school because that's where I feel I have more sense of control. UCLA is big. So we start in our school, which by the way, we're not just anymore the grad school of education. We now have an undergrad major in education and social transformation. So we've also grown and are growing and have now undergrads. But the effort has been mostly in our school. And of course, we're in constant conversation with the campus to see how they can replicate if they want, or try to modify it. The same with the Edi Ambassadors. We partner with the Ombuds office on campus to do the training on conflict management for our own Edi Ambassadors. So we are also we use the resources that the university provides and see how we can be a role model for the entire campus.
That's fantastic. Can you talk a little bit more about how long that process to establish the benchmarking occurred? How long did it take? And who did you include, either from the university wide or from your school particularly?
So this was something that the dean, interim dean, then now our permanent dean, Dr. Christie, and I thought about and said, well, let's also important to say we stipend a group of people in our community because we don't believe in this EDI work being volunteer work, which is usually, again, that's part of the performative aspect, is who wants to volunteer to do this work. So we're trying to shift that perspective and stipend members in our community to engage in this work and be compensated for it. That's, I think, an important thing to mention. We said, okay, let's invite a set of representatives from staff, from students and faculty who want to be at the table, work with us for a few months on the values and principles document. That's the first thing we needed to clarify. So we met over 6 months probably to just clarify that and devise the rubric. And once we revised the rubric, we felt comfortable enough to ask members of our community to then share their experiences with us, to assess to use the rubric to tell us where we are in relation to those goals. And now we have finalized the analysis process. So it's been taking us a year probably to, and now what we're going to do is use the results to engage in conversation, go to every corner of our school, research center, staff, units, right? You talked about human resources, business office, administrative assistants, as well as undergrad students, grad students in every division, every program, because we want to engage in a dialogue over the results of the exercise.
That's fantastic. Do you think, in your opinion, that this is something that other institutions could model, and even not, maybe even nonprofits or systems of healthcare? Is this something that others can do and replicate?
I think so. We've been sharing some of our process with K through 12 schools too. Some other teacher education programs, we've been talking to them and saying, would you want to entertain a process like this? We've been invited to share our process and what we've learned and what we are modifying and what we could do better. But my hope is that people can localize it, use it, borrow it, localize it so they can use it to make changes in their own place. The goal for us is to build a collective strategic plan. I think one of my mistakes when I started also this role is I tried to engage with let's say the supervisors, the director of human resources, the department chair, but not with the faculty per se, not with the people working day in and day out to sustain the school, with the students themselves. I talked to the student reps, but I hadn't gone to every division. So the approach had to change, I think. And that's why we're using this as a tool to engage in those conversations. So hopefully people can, again, use it in other settings.
That's great. Thank you so much. I guess I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us what guidance, what advice, or last thoughts you have for EDI professionals, or even those that aren't EDI professionals but are interested in this work.
I think one thing I learned is that we have no community of support. Particularly, I think I'm a Latina, I'm a mother scholar, and I felt isolated doing this work. I felt very isolated. And I know a lot of my colleagues around the country, people that I've written with or worked with, are now in leadership positions, are now department chairs, or so I see more and more, hopefully that change in administrators or whatever we're labeled as, having this chance to maybe make changes. But I don't see us collectively coming together to share what works, what doesn't work, to serve each other as to have like a learning community, support community. I would like to generate at some point that space so that we can share with each other our struggles and help each other do better in our own institutions and outside. more of a collective voice. So I wrote that on the blog, that I feel as a woman of color, as a mother, scholar, I have also my own challenges too, and my own limitations. I have my own biases and my need to check myself in many ways, and do it constantly. And I don't have a support system to be able to do that.
It's really interesting that you reference your background and your experiences as things that have helped you do this work. Are you still connected with the nonprofit in Mexico, and what have you done since your undergraduate work, and what have you connected back? I'd be really interested to know.
Well, the foundation still exists. The nonprofit still exists, which is probably something I'm pretty proud of. Of course, we are not involved. The original, I guess, people who started it, we all took different routes, but we wanted to leave something. So we were working really much for leaving a structure in place so that when we were not there, the work would continue. So I went to Mexico City in June, and I saw even the ads on the buses, and it just makes you feel good to know that, and they constantly check in with us, the people who now run the foundation, and it's great to see that, and I hope I take that as now my role. I want to leave an infrastructure too. That's why I also say it cannot be just one person. It needs to be now the Edi Ambassadors will stay if I change roles or move or do something. We have a new assistant dean of EDI that will for Black Life too, and it's going to hopefully help set an infrastructure. We had an EDI committee across the school, so I'm trying to build an infrastructure so that we don't depend on one person. We got to take care of each other, and we have to practice that conviviality, that convivencia, that makes us work together towards a collective, not just as EDI is the work of one person watching over others.
Yeah, that's great, and that EDI is a title. It's a title assigned to one person, but I agree. I think that it's more than one person. It's a village that takes to do this work. So thank you for all the advice and all your thoughts. I'd like to offer you an opportunity for any last thoughts or things you want to leave the audience with.
I really just want to thank again the people at the university who just invited me to go back home. It feels like that, and I'm just so appreciative of all the opportunities that I received when I was there, but also now to stay connected and to this format of the real conversation. I really resonated with me because I think that's what we need more: transparency, real, honest conversations about our struggles and what it takes to do this work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And what an amazing thought and note to leave on. So we're just about at time, a little earlier, but thank you once again, Dr. Rios Aguilar, for sharing your insights and experiences, and thank you for your suggestions. I know that I will be incorporating them into my daily work, and I hope others will too. So thank you to everyone who joined us for today's program. I will invite you to all to join us for next month's 2022 MLK Commemorative Address. Event details here will be added to the chat, and I invite you all to register and attend. Thank you again to the Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement for putting this important and timely program together in partnership with the Office of Equity and Inclusion and the Diversity Advisory Council. You'll now be directed to a brief survey to share your feedback on this program and an opportunity to suggest ideas for future events. Wishing everyone a healthy and happy 2022. Thank you, and Meliora.